Nobody expected the night to spiral the way it did. Kirk Frost and Lil Scrappy were supposed to share the same stage in celebration. But instead, fans witnessed a heated exchange that quickly became the talk of the entire love and hip-hop circle. What started as playful banter reportedly turned into something darker, with words cutting deeper than anyone anticipated. Witnesses claimed tensions had been simmering for weeks. And this was the moment when everything finally boiled over. Voice carried across the room, frustration spilling out as he questioned loyalty and respect, while Kirk, never one to back down, matched his energy word for word. Emotions ran high, and people nearby said the air was so thick with tension, you could almost feel it pressing on your chest. Okay? The shock was written all over the faces of everyone present. But the moment that really stunned fans was Momma Dee stepping in, always outspoken and never shy about defending her son. Her reaction added fuel to the already raging fire. The clash wasn't just about two men trading insults, it hinted at something deeper, something raw and unresolved. And now the entire LHH community is buzzing, asking what really pushed this feud over the edge. The night had grown heavier with silence. The whispers in the city refused to rest. People crowded small corners of bars, street sides, and dimly lit living rooms, all buzzing with the same story that had taken hold of every mind. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. The sudden death of T-Hood was now a reality nobody knew how to process. He had been more than a rapper. He was a symbol of raw, unfiltered energy, a man who carried his pain into his music and laid it bare for everyone to see. When news of his passing first hit, many refused to believe it. Some thought it was another publicity stunt, a cruel joke the internet loved to play on its stars. But as hours turned into days, as footage surfaced, and his voices closest to him began to crack under the weight of grief, the truth settled in like a heavy storm cloud that would not leave. Those who knew him well could barely hold back their emotions. One friend described him as the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and make it feel like home. Others painted him as a troubled soul, someone battling demons that only grew louder the more successful he became. The contradictions around his character made him even more magnetic. But no matter how anyone saw him, no one could deny the power. He carried on stage. He wasn't polished, he wasn't perfect, but he was real. And in an industry where authenticity had long been questioned, he stood as a rare voice that felt unshakably genuine. The circumstances of his death only deepened the mystery. Reports conflicted. Some said it was an accident, a tragic twist of fate. Others whispered darker stories, hinting at betrayal, at hidden hands pulling strings behind the scenes. As the speculation grew, so did the tension between his fans and the industry that had once praised him. Why was there no clear answer? Why did those closest to him remain so guarded, speaking in half sentences and carefully chosen words? Every detail released to the public seemed to open a new door, one leading to a maze of questions with no way out. The more people tried to understand, the further they felt from the truth. In the middle of this storm, his family found themselves, both grieving and under a spotlight they never asked for. Cameras flashed at vigils, microphones shoved in their faces, questions fired at them when all they wanted was silence. His mother, overwhelmed, broke down during one gathering, crying out that her son was not supposed to leave so soon. Her pain echoed through the crowd, piercing even those who had never met him personally. The bond between T-Hood and his family had always been complicated, filled with highs and lows, but now every unresolved conflict was frozen in time. The loss had left a wound that would not close, and the world was watching every tear, every expression, every word they spoke. Meanwhile, the industry struggled with its own guilt. Producers who had worked with him started releasing statements about how much they believed in his potential, about the conversations they had, the dreams they had planned. But behind these words, many fans detected insincerity. Where were these voices when he needed them most? Where were they when he was crying out through his lyrics, asking for help in ways few noticed? The hypocrisy stung, and social media became a battlefield of blame. Some accused the industry of exploiting him until he had nothing left to give. Others defended it, arguing that personal choices played a bigger role. But regardless of where the blame was placed, everyone agreed on one thing: his death left a hole that could not be filled. As the story grew, so did the theories. People online began piecing together fragments of his last days, videos, live streams, and private conversations that suddenly gained new meaning. A line in one of his final posts about being surrounded by people who didn't truly care sent chills down the spines of his followers. Was it a hint? Was it a confession of the pressure he was under? The uncertainty drove fans deeper into their search for answers. Forums filled with discussions, threads stretched endlessly, and every piece of information was dissected. In their grief, people clung to speculation as if it could bring him back, or at least make sense of the chaos left behind. Among the chaos, one name kept surfacing: a friend turned rival, someone who had shared stages with him but later fell into a bitter feud. The details of their fallout were never fully revealed, but many believed it had something to do with betrayal over money and loyalty. Whispers suggested that this person knew more about the days leading up to his death than anyone else. The silence from that camp was deafening, and the lack of a statement only fueled suspicion. The fans wanted answers, the family wanted peace, and the industry wanted control over the narrative, but no one was willing to give what the other demanded. The tension was unbearable. Yet beyond all the speculation, most haunting detail came from those who were with him in his final hours. They described him as restless, pacing, speaking in fragments that didn't always connect, as though his mind was battling two realities at once. He had moments of clarity, speaking about plans for new music, about how he was ready to start over to take things more seriously. But then his voice would break. His hands would tremble, and he would fall silent. One person said he looked like a man carrying a weight no one else could see, a weight too heavy for any one person to bear. Those images of him lingered in the minds of those who cared, painting a picture not of a rapper gone too soon, but of a human being suffocated by forces too big to fight alone. The city where he came from felt his loss the hardest. Murals began to appear almost overnight, painted on walls and bridges, capturing his image with words like forever and never forgotten. His music played out of car windows, blasting through neighborhoods where he once walked. It was as though the streets refused to let his voice die. Fans lit candles, left flowers, and shared stories about how his songs had carried them through their darkest times. For them, he wasn't just an artist, he was a companion in struggle, a friend in moments of loneliness, a reminder that pain could be turned into something powerful. The collective grief became a movement, transforming into both tribute and protest, demanding that his name not be forgotten or reduced to another statistic. But in the midst of mourning, darker shadows began to creep into the narrative. People close to him started receiving threats, subtle warnings to keep their mouths shut. Journalists digging too deep into the circumstances of his death suddenly found doors slammed in their faces. Certain interviews were pulled, footage mysteriously vanished, and sources who once spoke freely now backed away. It was as if someone wanted the story to remain incomplete, to keep the truth buried beneath layers of confusion. This silence was louder than any answer could be, raising suspicion that something bigger, The reactions came quickly, overlapping in a chaotic wave of disbelief, anger, and desperation. One person slammed their hand on the table, demanding answers, while another tried to calm things down, their voice cracking under the pressure of keeping peace. The room was no longer united, it had become a battlefield of emotions. The tension climbed with each second, voices rising, accusations flying, and every gesture becoming sharper, more threatening. Somewhere deep down, everyone knew there was no going back to how things were before. Too much had been said, too much had been revealed. In the middle of it all, one person remained eerily quiet, their eyes scanning every face in the room. They weren't reacting like the others, at least not outwardly. Instead, there was a cold calculation behind their silence, as though they were piecing together a plan in real time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with words that could cut deeper than any knife. When they finally spoke, the effect was instant. The room fell into a stunned hush, as though everyone had instinctively realized that whatever came next would shift the balance completely. The words were measured, deliberate, and full of implications that none could ignore. It wasn't just about defending themselves. It was about exposing weaknesses in others. Subtle reminders of past mistakes were dropped like daggers, carefully aimed at reopening old wounds. The strategy was cruel but effective. One by one, those who had been loudest began to falter, their confidence crumbling as the weight of past missteps returned to haunt them. Suddenly, those who had been standing tall found themselves on the defensive, their voices losing strength, their arguments breaking apart. Still, not everyone was willing to be silenced. A sudden outburst cut through the atmosphere like thunder, and all eyes snapped to the source. Their anger was undeniable. But beneath it lay a vulnerability that made the outburst feel less like an attack and more like a cry for help. They were tired of carrying the burden alone, tired of pretending to be strong while silently falling apart. Their words painted a picture of betrayal, of sacrifices made and never acknowledged, of love given freely but never truly returned. Each sentence struck with honesty so raw that even those most hardened by conflict couldn't help but feel the sting. But instead of softening hearts, the vulnerability fueled more division. Some sympathized, nodding along as though finally hearing the truth they had been too afraid to speak themselves. Others grew defensive, unwilling to accept blame, unwilling to acknowledge their part in the growing storm. The divide grew wider, and what had started as a heated argument began spiraling into chaos once again. Voices overlapped, tears mixed with fury, and in the midst of it all, the fear of complete collapse loomed over them like a dark shadow. Outside the room, whispers had already started spreading. What was happening inside wasn't staying hidden. Fragments of the truth were slipping through the cracks, carried by those who couldn't contain the shock of what they had just heard. Rumors moved fast, picking up momentum with every retelling. By the time the argument reached its peak inside, the world outside had already begun to buzz with speculation, each rumor more exaggerated than the last. Soon, what was once a private conflict would explode into public scandal, impossible to contain, impossible to deny. Back inside, the exhaustion began to show. The shouting grew weaker, voices cracked, and the energy that had once fueled the storm began to drain away. People sank into their chairs, their anger replaced by silence, their eyes avoiding one another as though the truth had become too heavy to look at directly. The quiet wasn't peaceful, though it was suffocating, filled with unspoken words and the awareness that nothing had been resolved. In fact, things were worse than before. Trust had been shattered, relationships had been poisoned, and every attempt to move forward felt futile. Then came a voice that no one expected, soft but steady, breaking through the stillness. It wasn't the voice of authority, nor the voice of someone who had dominated the arguments earlier. Instead, it belonged to someone who had remained mostly in the background until now, watching, listening, waiting. Their words were not laced with accusation, nor with cold strategy, but with something different: an appeal for honesty, for accountability, for a chance to step back from the brink before it was too late. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor a demand for loyalty. It was a challenge to face the truth fully, without hiding, without twisting, without running away. The effect was unexpected. Some listened with tears welling in their eyes, realizing the depth of the pain that had been ignored for too long. Others shifted uncomfortably, resisting the call for vulnerability but unable to dismiss it entirely. The room was once again caught between collapse and reconciliation, teetering on the edge with no clear direction forward. No one spoke for a long time after, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear or avoidance, it was the silence of reckoning, of realizing that something had to change. Even if no one knew how. As the weight of that moment lingered, the door creaked open. And the presence of someone who had been absent throughout the chaos sent a ripple of shock through the room. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere entirely, because their very presence carried power, influence, and the potential to alter everything that had been said. Eyes widened, breaths caught, and hearts raced. As though everyone knew instinctively that the story was far from over, that the real consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The news spread like wildfire, and the chaos it brought only grew larger with every passing hour. People were arguing online, creating theories and speculations, while those close to the situation were quietly scrambling behind the scenes. It was not just a scandal anymore. It was becoming a full-blown crisis, the kind that could leave permanent scars on reputations and relationships. Whispers started circulating about who knew what and when they knew it, making trust an even rarer thing. Every glance, every silence, every hesitation suddenly seemed suspicious. Those who once stood firmly side by side were now second-guessing each other's loyalty. Behind closed doors, tempers flared as accusations flew across the room. There was no calm, no understanding, only a sense of betrayal thick enough to choke anyone who dared speak. People who were once allies now looked like enemies forced to share the same space. Words that should have been measured came out sharp, and secrets that should have been guarded slipped in moments of rage. Nobody wanted to take responsibility, but everybody wanted to point fingers. Outside the circle, the media painted its own picture. They pieced together fragments of information, twisting them into narratives that fit their headlines. After became full-blown stories, and rumors were presented as facts. Didn't matter what was real anymore. What mattered was what could capture the most attention. Fans consumed it all, feeding into the frenzy, while those at the center of it had no control over their own story. The pressure became unbearable as each passing day brought another wave of speculation, another layer of confusion. Relationships began to crumble under the weight of doubt. Conversations turned into arguments, and arguments turned into silence. The people involved were stuck in an endless cycle of defending themselves and questioning others. Moments that once held laughter and trust now carried suspicion and distance. It felt as though the very foundation that held them together was cracking piece by piece, and no one knew how to stop it from collapsing completely. Then came the unexpected confrontation that nobody saw coming. Emotions were already raw, and the smallest spark was enough to ignite an explosion. Words were exchanged that should never have been spoken, cutting deeper than anyone anticipated. What started as a heated argument spiraled into something uglier, something that couldn't be brushed off as just another disagreement. It was loud, it was public, yet even in the darkest moments, there were glimpses of vulnerability. The truth was, beneath the anger and the shouting, there was hurt, deep, painful hurt. People who had once been close were now staring at each other as strangers, yet part of them longed to go back to what it used to be. The problem was, the words had already been spoken, the actions already taken. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced, and healing wasn't something that could happen overnight. Still, in quiet moments when the cameras weren't flashing and the voices weren't shouting, there was an ache for peace, for some kind of resolution. As days turned into weeks, the intensity didn't die down. New developments kept the story alive, with each twist dragging more people into the chaos. Even those who tried to stay on the sidelines were eventually pulled into the mess. Their names mentioned in posts and their reputations questioned. No one was safe from the ripple effect. The story had grown too big, too messy, too interconnected to simply fade away. One night, in a dimly lit room away from the noise, two of the central figures finally faced each other without the cameras, without the noise of social media, without the crowd of voices trying to influence their every word. The silence between them was heavy, but it was different from the explosive moments they had shared before. This silence was filled with exhaustion, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, but the destruction remains. They didn't need to shout this time. The pain was already written on their faces. When the words finally came, they were quieter, but no less impactful. It wasn't about pointing fingers or defending themselves anymore. It was about admitting the damage, acknowledging the hurt, and recognizing how far things had gone. The conversation wasn't neat, it wasn't clean, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, there was honesty, stripped of anger and pretense. But honesty didn't mean resolution. The reality was, too much had been broken to be fixed. In a single conversation, it's trust. Once shattered, doesn't rebuild itself so easily. Yet that moment, raw and unfiltered, was a reminder that beneath the chaos, there were still human hearts beating, still emotions that couldn't be erased by the frenzy of public opinion. The storm outside didn't stop. The headlines didn't slow, and the speculation didn't end. But within that small, fragile space, something shifted. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was the faintest glimmer of what could be the beginning of change. And as they walked away from that room, the question that lingered was whether that fragile glimmer would be enough to withstand the fire waiting for them outside. The night outside the hospital was darker than usual, as if the city itself was weighed down by the chaos brewing inside. Flashing lights from media vans kept bouncing off the glass doors, where security tried to hold back a crowd of restless fans and reporters desperate for the next update. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. Every breath seemed heavy, every glance loaded with questions no one dared to voice. The doctors had just finished another round of tests, and their silence spoke louder than any words. The family sat together in the waiting area, exhaustion painted across their faces. Bambi clutched her phone, scrolling through endless messages, some of comfort, some of anger, and some outright cruel. Momma Dee muttered under her breath, half prayers and half frustrations. While the kids sat huddled together, sensing the storm but not fully understanding its depth, suddenly the doors to the intensive care unit opened and a doctor stepped out with a grim look. All eyes shot up, waiting, holding their breath. His voice was calm but carried the weight of what was coming. He explained that the latest scans revealed complications they hadn't expected, and while Scrappy had moments of strength, his body was struggling to fight off the damage. The words cut through everyone like glass. Bambi broke down instantly, her sobs echoing through the hall, while Momma Dee's face hardened, anger mixing with fear as she demanded to know if enough was being done. The doctor assured them that every possible step was being taken, but the uncertainty lingered like a shadow none of them could escape. As the news began to spread, social media exploded once again. Hashtags about Scrappy's condition trended worldwide, with fans posting prayers, old concert clips, and messages filled with love. But along with the support came speculation and rumors, twisting the situation into something almost unrecognizable. Some claimed Scrappy's health issues were tied to long-hidden secrets, while others accused family members of using the crisis for attention. The noise outside only added fuel to the fire burning within the family. Amidst the chaos, Rashida arrived, her face tense and eyes swollen from tears. She went straight to Bambi, embracing her tightly, whispering that she was there for her no matter what. Though Rashida had her own battles with the industry and with Kirk, she couldn't stay away knowing Scrappy was fighting for his life. Her presence brought a strange calm, but it also stirred up more whispers among fans online, who speculated about the sudden closeness between her and Bambi. Hours stretched into what felt like days. The family rotated visits to Scrappy's bedside, each moment inside the ICU feeling like it could be the last. His body lay still, machines doing the work his strength could no longer manage. But every so often, his fingers twitched or his eyelids fluttered, sparking a fragile hope. Bambi leaned over him, whispering words of love and promises of a future together, her tears dripping onto his hand. Momma Dee sang softly, old gospel hymns that filled the sterile room with echoes of something far deeper than medicine. Then, without warning, Scrappy's heart monitor spiked, the sound sharp and terrifying. Nurses rushed in, calling for the doctor as the family was pushed out of the room. Panic spread through the hallway like wildfire, with Bambi collapsing to the floor, screaming for him to hold on. The chaos inside the room was hidden behind closed doors, but the sounds of machines beeping and urgent voices carried through, making every second feel like an eternity outside the hospital. The media caught wind of the emergency and began broadcasting live updates with headlines screaming about Scrappy's final moments and tragic end. The frenzy painted a picture far more dramatic than reality, yet the fear that it could be true weighed heavy on everyone watching. Fans gathered in prayer circles outside, some holding candles, others singing his songs in unison, turning the hospital grounds into a vigil that stretched deep into the night. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, the doctor reemerged. His face showed exhaustion, but there was also a spark of relief. Scrappy had made it through the scare, though his condition remained critical. The words brought a wave of emotions, with cheers erupting outside as the news reached the fans. Inside, Bambi and Momma Dee clung to each other, their differences momentarily erased by the shared gratitude that he was still alive. The reprieve, however, did not ease the growing strain among the family. Arguments broke out over who was allowed inside the room, who was making decisions, and who had the right to speak on Scrappy's behalf to the public. The lines between love, control, and ego blurred, creating a new battle even as Scrappy lay fighting for his life. Bambi accused Momma Dee of trying to turn the situation into a spectacle, while Momma Dee fired back that Bambi was too busy worrying about appearances instead of praying for her son. The tension boiled over in the waiting room, forcing security to step in before the heated words turned into something worse, while the family tore itself apart. Fans online continued to speculate, some even claiming they had inside sources revealing details no one else knew. The city outside kept moving, but inside the hospital walls, time stood still. Scrappy's fight was no longer just his on it, had become a battle shared by his family, his fans, and the millions watching from afar, all waiting to see whether he would rise again or be remembered in tragedy. Family, the story you've just heard is more than just another scandal or another headline. It's a raw reminder of how fragile relationships, loyalty, and trust really are when the world is watching. Seen secrets come out, we've seen unexpected twists, and we've witnessed emotions boiling over to the point where there's no turning back. But here's the thing, this isn't just about them, it's about us too. How do we deal with betrayal when it shows up in our own lives? Do we react when the people we trust the most are the ones who shake us at our core? These are the questions that keep us hooked, because drama may play out on screen, but its reflections are real in everyday life. Now, I want to hear from you. What side are you on in this situation? Do you believe the choices made here were justified? Or do you think this went way too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters in shaping how these stories unfold in our community. And don't just stop there. Hit that like button if this video kept you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe so you never miss the next shocking update. And share this with someone who lives for the drama just like you do. Trust me, the next chapter is coming, and you don't want to be the one left behind when the truth hits even harder.